Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. Is the urge to travel a universal human instinct? I'm joined today by Amira Bennison, professor in the history and culture of the Maghreb at the University of Cambridge. Amira recently wrote an essay for New Lines on 12th century travel and tourism texts, medieval versions of Lonely Planet, as it were. Just as there are today, there were many different genres of travel writing during this period, and Amira guides us through them and shows not only that, yes, the impulse to travel is universal, but that the desire to read other travellers' accounts of faraway places is too. Medieval readers shared much the same concerns as modern ones. Are things expensive there? What should I go and see? But most of all, they wanted to hear tall tales from distant places to set their imaginations alight. Amira, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Lydia. It's a real pleasure to be here with you to talk about my medieval travellers.
Well, actually, your PhD explored the 1830 French conquest of Algiers. Can you talk us through then how you got from French colonialism to medieval travel and tourism?
Funnily enough, I probably got there through leading tourists myself. After after I got my PhD, I did quite a lot of work for an Australian company leading tour groups around various parts of the Middle East. I led tours in Syria, in Egypt, in Morocco, across the Strait of Gibraltar, in Islamic or the previously Islamic parts of the Iberian Peninsula. And I began to explain the history of those places to groups of, interested travelers and
Oh,
sort of bring that combination of history and landscape together and to be able to talk about different dynasties in the context of where they went, where they built, what was important to them in terms of the environment. So that really kind of stimulated a turn, if you like, in my work from thinking about the legitimation of different regimes through things like jihad or more kind of conceptual discourses to how they legitimize themselves by actually physically modifying towns by building a palace, by building a mosque, by improving water supply, and so on and so forth. So that was sort of how that journey developed. And I've always been interested in dynasties, so it's been natural for me to sort of write surveys of dynasties, but sort of trying to bring in all these different dimensions, the politics, but also the society, the city, and so on.
that's fascinating, especially that personal aspect of actually being a travel guide yourself. There must have been a lot to recognize in the subsequent reading you did in travel. So in your essay, you categorize a lot of the travel texts that you've read from the 12th century into three genres. And I'll run through them. The first is often called the books of routes and kingdoms, Kitab al-Mamalik, or books of countries. Now, they sounded to me closest to our own guidebooks, perhaps. Can you describe them a little bit and say if that's fair, or is it a historian's nightmare to compare an old genre to a contemporary one?
It probably is a bit of a historian's nightmare, to be honest. They are quite different to modern guidebooks because the author might go on quite a long historical excursus. So there might be pages of historical narration kind of inserted within something that does look a little bit more like a modern travel guide. I think the most functional of these works are actually not really like modern tour books or guides because they are very perfunctory, if you like. They simply sort of spend a lot of time saying the next journey stages from this place to that place. Then the next journey stages from that place to the next one along the line. So you can go for a page or two where it's very, very dry and it's almost like a word map, if you like, just
Mm.
telling you where the network is. And then the description comes in when you get to a bigger, more significant city. And then there may be topographical information, there might be historical information, and then there might be one of these little excursuses which it whizzes off and talks about a particular dynasty or the founder of the city or some other sort of vaguely relevant set of information, but that's not consistent. You wouldn't always get that. So you may or you may not get one of these little sort of historical interpolations with all the topographical description. They are very interested in agriculture.
That's a difference. Where do you think that comes from?
I think again it comes from the commercial aspect of a lot of these books, the fact that they may well be merchant manuals in some cases, and they're sort of handy, if you want to engage in commerce, you in this period you'll probably buy and sell a range of items. Most people didn't specialize in exclusively one product. So it's
Mm.
really handy to know, for instance, that Gafsa in Tunisia has lots of great dates of different types. It's got lots of olives, but it's also got very fine textiles and some great pottery.
Mm.
So
Mm.
you sort of get an idea of the products of the area as a whole, which are brought into the city and which you can buy and sell if you're a merchant.
And of course, agriculture's a key part of those sorts of markets. So it's just included as any economic activity. Is that what you mean?
Yes, exactly. That is what I mean. I mean, these are agricultural societies. It's easy to forget that, but
Right. Right.
moving foodstuffs around is really probably the bulk of the commerce that actually
Mm.
takes place. We get very carried away with saffron and jewelry and this, that, and the other, and sort of the high
Yeah.
end
Yeah.
of commerce.
Commerce.
But
Yeah.
the reality is wheat,
Y
grapes,
Yes.
olives, the things you really need to survive rather than all these luxury items which are moved around in much smaller quantities.
And then there was my favorite genre, which sound and I'm so sorry for another ahistorical comparison that you will probably hate. They sound almost like Seabelt in their and how can I put this politely? Their penchant for tall tales. I think in the essay you describe them as a blending of fact and fiction, which is essentially what Seabelt was doing. And this, of course, is the Books of Wonders and Rarities, Kitab al-Ajaib wal-Gharaib. Can you give us some examples of the taller tales of these wonders and rarities?
I mean, this is where we move more towards, um, 1001 Nights kind of stories. So you will have some of these books which have a factual base and will talk about a number of different locations which are fairly well known in quite a straightforward manner, but that they'll then bring in some other places, if you like, that are on the fringe. So there are tales of a statue in Cadiz which speaks, or cities of bronze or salt in the desert, which are sort of just slightly beyond where people normally go. So these kind of things.
And do you think people were supposed to believe them or were they supposed to entertain as fiction?
I think there's always that suspense of disbelief element when you
Yeah.
read these kind of books. I mean, I don't think that people in the past were necessarily naive or necessarily taken in by these kind of stories, but the world was much more mysterious as well. And there were lots of places where most people had never been and would never go.
Mm.
And really weren't quite sure whether these things existed or not. So I guess people take the stories with a pinch of salt, but they like them and they like imagining that maybe they're true.
Well, I mean, we can we don't really have to look at as far back as the 12th century to look for naivety in believing travelers' tales. This has been a key feature. I think Herodotus is the most famous example, and we have Marco Polo, who occasionally stretched the truth, and right through until now. I mean, look at the ease in which misinformation and disinformation can spread around the internet. I think there's somehow, um, a desire to believe in the more outrageous and the more mysterious and magical maybe.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think that's what I mean by suspension of disbelief.
Right,
You know,
right.
you one could be highly critical, but on the other hand, one could just kind of go with it and
Yeah, and
enjoy the
enjoy it.
story and,
Yeah,
not really question it particularly, but just think, "Oh, wow, there's this crazy place sort of just
yeah,
beyond where I can actually go," or this
yes.
sort of strange fact.
Yeah, I think that's why it was the favourite of the ones you described, to be honest. I like that myself.
I mean, I also in the essay I mention the rumors that when the Almohad Caliph Al-Mansur took the statue from the gates of Cordoba, then this strange wind blew up in a sort of raging storm around Cordoba because the talisman of the city had been taken. I mean, I love those kind of stories too, because obviously these things can be completely coincidental. But, we also know that if something significant happens in our lives and there's suddenly a storm or something, we do feel the symbolism of the, those two events occurring simultaneously.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it does feel like a human universal. And then we have the third type of writing that you define, which was the rihla, a travel account written in the first person, that usually recounted the long journey to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, which is required of Muslims at least once in a lifetime. And this, of course, is a key difference to Christian culture. Christians had plenty of opportunities for pilgrimage, of course, all over Europe and the Holy Land, but it wasn't a requirement for all in the way it is in Islam. Do you think that this different attitude to pilgrimage is reflected in travel writing of the different religious cultures of the 12th century, or is the impulse truly more universal?
That's a good question. I think there is a difference, but I think the difference is more that because the pilgrimage occurs at a specific time of year, it's a real gathering of people from all over the Islamic world engaged in exactly the same activity at the same time.
Mm,
And although it is a requirement, I think we have to remember that in the 12th century, most people still didn't do it.
no,
Because
right.
it
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 was
it
still
is
limited.
it's a legal requirement, but only if you've got the resources to do it, and most people in the 12th century obviously did not have the resources to do it. But I think just that sense that you should perform a pilgrimage does, encourage a particular group of people who are often the writers of these travel accounts, sort of what we might call, like, anachronistically middle-class men, to travel along the pilgrim routes and use it as an opportunity to do other things. They can sort of justify leaving home, If you need to explain to your mother why you intend to go for 3 years, you can sort of say, "Well, but mother, I'm doing the pilgrimage." And what can she say? She can't complain.
Yes, well, you mentioned one specific example of the rihla, which was the extremely popular version of the time by Ibn Jubair. And there's one intriguing detail that you mention, which is that he's very concerned with buildings, and that includes mosques, churches, and shrines, and also the big showy buildings, like hospitals and madrasas, the theological colleges, that people might have built for a very specific political reason. And I wanted to dig down a little into this. First of all, did he have any particular view of Christian pilgrims in a text that is really on the Muslim Hajj?
Yeah, I mean, most Rihla accounts are about much more than the Hajj.
Mm.
It is about the journey. I mean, the word Rihla means
Yeah.
journey. So it is actually about the journey to Mecca, as well as the performance of the Hajj rituals within Mecca, and the visit to Medina, the Prophet city, which is normally part of that trip as well. So people want to describe everywhere they pass through on the route. And in the case of Syria, which obviously has it's the holy land for all three Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And people like Ibn Jubayr were very aware of the Christian presence in Syria, and they visit a lot of shrines that we might think of as being Christian, but are actually really shared by peoples of all three religions,
Mm,
because the same prophets appear in Jewish scripture, Christian scripture, and in the Quran. So,
mm,
you know, people of all faiths venerate Abraham, for instance, and want to go to various places that relate to um, what we might see as Old Testament stories of
mm.
the prophets. So it's a kind of very much a shared landscape, and Ibn Jubayr and others like him, would see Jews and particularly Christians, because there were a large number of Christians in the region, going to those shrines alongside Muslims.
Now, he does take in a lot of cities along the way that are familiar to us. As you say, he went through Syria, for example. And now that I know that you've been a tour guide in Syria, I actually have a more personal question for you on that. Um, you must be deeply familiar with some of the places he was writing about, and maybe other ones weren't so familiar to you. So, was it very different reading about those ones that you yourself have described to hordes of tourists, to those you know less well?
I'm not sure I really thought close. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the new foundations he talks about, the hospitals and madrasas of Nuruddin Zangi and
Mm,
Salahuddin or Saladin. So I was particularly interested in those, and I did find it very interesting to see them through the eyes of Ibn Jubayr as well as through modern eyes.
mm,
Uh,
mm.
I kind of just visited other places and explored them in, looking at them from my own perspective, but also being aware of how they might have looked to people traveling from North Africa or other parts of the Islamic world at the time.
Now, you make the argument that it wasn't only armchair travelers that were enjoying these books. In the case of Ibn Jubayr and his younger contemporary, Muhammad ibn Abd Rabi, they both had close connections with the ruling dynasty, the Almohads. So, my question is about the connection between their geographical writings and the ruling powers of the time.
I personally think there's quite a close connection, and recent scholarship would agree, and in fact has informed my own thinking. And we're talking here about the Almohad dynasty, and it's easy to forget how powerful they were in the 12th century, and to sort of tend to think of Muslim dynasties as being in the Middle East and not really pay much heed to North Africa. But really, in the 12th century Mediterranean Muslim world, the Almohads were the biggest, most powerful regime around, and they saw themselves in those terms, and they saw themselves very much as heirs to important dynasties who had ruled not just in the Western Mediterranean, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly the Umayyads of Syria, who had been the predecessors of the Umayyads of the Iberian Peninsula, whom the Almohads very much modeled themselves on. So I see people like Ibn Jubayr and Ibn Abd as looking at sites and being interested and engaged by them, but also sort of thinking about how the building projects of their own masters, the Almohads, can sort of interact with that past and make references to it, whether the past in Syria or North Africa or the Iberian Peninsula.
So, this was part of identity building.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see it very much in those terms. In that sense, I see the Almohads as being quite modern, or
Mm.
or perhaps more, it's just something that, regimes in power have been doing, continuously from sort of the time of the earliest civilization onwards, trying to make one's mark in some way and trying to demonstrate through visual means, through, palaces or cities or other structures, religious or secular, pyramids, what you're about, how your subjects should see you. And, obviously today we have many more methods of conveying ideas and images very quickly to people. But, in this period, a building said a lot. And it's
Yes.
something that people could actually go and see. I mean, the other thing that said a lot, which one often forgets, is currency.
Ah,
You
in
know, the
terms
fact
of,
yeah, the
and
fact that you can
I,
have a little religious motto on
mm,
currency. You can
mm.
have the name of a ruler on currency. So, and it's something that people have to handle the whole time.
Yes, exactly. It's daily.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
the inhabitants of cities are seeing the buildings daily. Both things, the big and the small, making a constant impression. It's about legitimation, isn't it?
Yes, it really can be. And I do feel that when Ibn Jubayr is carefully describing new hospitals and new theological colleges or madrasas, he is in part trying to inform his master, the caliph or ruler Al Mansur, that this is the kind of the power building of the time. And that, if Al Mansur wants to be sort of an international Islamic figure, he might well consider building a hospital or a madrasa, for instance.
It's political as well as armchair travel.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And both the figures I concentrate on in my piece are not armchair travelers. I only mention one armchair traveler, Al Bakri, who's sort of a very famous geographer, but he was kind of, if you like, an academic, a researcher, sitting in the Iberian Peninsula. But these two figures from the Almohad period are people who traveled extensively.
And so I want to just explore any more reasons there might have been to write. I mean, some is for entertainment, for a general public, general in this time out of the literate public, of course. But then we've already mentioned the political, and we've touched on the religious reasons that there were descriptions of shrines and Mecca and so on. But you mentioned other ones. Intriguingly, there was a connection with intelligence gathering,
Yes, and whether that was actually going on or not is hard to say, but,
as
um
ever.
well, indeed, I mean, it's the nature of intelligence gathering really, isn't it?
Well, exactly. So what's the link that you noticed then?
It's an idea that's been put forward in the case of the famous scholar Idrisi's big geographical work, which was produced for the contemporary Norman king of Sicily, King Roger,
Mm.
which sort of gave a quite detailed account of the towns, the ports, the agricultural products, and other commodities of the Western Islamic Mediterranean and further afield, in fact, for King Roger. And there's a possibility that people like Ibn Abdurrabbi are also writing to give the caliph information about the area he rules and to make him aware of the commodities, of what's there in the landscape, the different peoples who inhabit that space.
Well, it's a legitimate kind of grey area, isn't it? And that's what a lot of intelligence is. There's a lot of knowledge in the public domain that is very useful to rulers in an intelligence type way. And that's, I mean, scholars of all descriptions, but I would say especially anthropologists, could easily be accused of the same type of work.
Yes, indeed. And as you say, any gathering of information is sort of intelligence gathering in a
Yeah,
sense. It's
potentially,
just
yeah.
to know better what's out there, and then you may or may not use that information in your political or military decision making.
Well, exactly. Research is research. It gets turned into intelligence by its use, I suppose.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, Ibn Abdurrabbi, in particular, does seem to be working for the Caliph al-Mansur quite directly when he's traveling all over the empire
Mm.
and collecting the information that then goes into his book.
Well, why do you think people were so interested in reading these travel tales, where whatever type they were?
I think there's a variety of reasons why people wanted to read this kind of writing. I think, there's the utilitarian aspect that
Yeah.
we've already mentioned in terms of garnering information if you're a merchant or indeed if you're a ruler. I think in the case of the travelers themselves as well as their readers, there also is just that enjoyment of things that are unusual and
Yeah.
different, a kind of broadening of one's mental horizons, that sense of experience. Something we haven't really talked about is Ibn Abdurrabbi's really very touristic interventions in his own text, where he suddenly becomes very personal and sort of describes the sort of the physical experience of being somewhere, whether it's sort of listening to a river roaring in a ravine from the high
Mm.
bridge at Constantine, or being in the echoing cisterns of Carthage. And I think it's that which really captures people's imagination and
Mm.
gives them this sense of the expansiveness of the world and the sort of the potentiality out there, and sort of takes them out of what, for some readers, must have been a much more sort of humdrum existence, with
Mm.
little chance of travel beyond their own town or country.
So, as much as any other type of literature, really, offering people new experiences beyond their own.
I think so. It's a broadening of the imagination, isn't it?
It is, and that's a lovely note to leave on. So, Amira Bennison, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This has been The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. This week's episode was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com, where you can also read Amira's essay on medieval tourism. Thank you all for joining us.